Once upon a long time ago within the sleepy town of Dorothy Vale, a child known as Marky was on his way to the outskirts of town. He was riding his bike across the gravelly asphalt, constantly bumping as each inch of wheel met a new upheaval of rock. He was going to his new job at the old farm. His grandfather had pulled some strings, which allowed Marky the task of checking in on the animals around the farmland for a meager payoff. Marky was excited for this opportunity regardless. He was 12 years old, and had never had a job in which people actually expected him to be productive. In his childlike mind, the thought of helping the adults seemed like a privilege more than work. So he eagerly strode faster and faster to the old farm, trying to show up right on time, to appease the other farm hands. Marky stopped suddenly, the wheels on his bike screeching as his brakes tightened. To Marky's left was an old cast-iron fence. Beyond that was a pathway that traveled up to the old Hodges place. The child became intimidated by the visage of the old building. He had heard the stories about that place, about how the place was haunted, and kids had gone missing around the area. The chill ran down his spine, making him begin to nervously ride away from the old house. Marky didn't realize that the way to the old farm lead past Hodges' place. Had he known, he may have never accepted the job. The thought of having to pass such a notorious area each day was burdensome. Thinking of such things made time fly, and soon enough he arrived at the farm. Marky quickly strode up the old dirt road leading to the farmhouse. He reached the front drive and dropped his bike under an evergreen tree. He jogged to the front porch, and made his way up old jagged steps of stone. Then, after clearing his throat, and straightening his stance, he knocked on the door. The door opened and on the other side was a rather tall figure. He was a younger kid, about 16. His hair was long and straight, and hung under his chin. The kid wore torn-up jeans and red Converse, as well as a shirt depicting buddies being hung from crosses. Marky seemed perplexed, and wondered if this was even the correct house. Soon he was relieved when the figure spoke. His voice was gravely and much deeper than other teenagers his age. "Hey man, you must be the new help. Tight look, go around the farmland, and make sure all the animals are just doing nothing. Pigs should be lying in the mud, cows should be eating grass, chickens' coop should be closed, and the garden should just be a garden. Go walk around and check everything. Once it's all done, come get me, and make sure to do at least 3 whole rounds. That or fata do it." Marky nodded, and was soon staring at a door closed in his face. He sighed, and walked down the old steps. Marky began meandering around the farm. He smiled at the pigs rolling around. He made sure to keep distance from the cattle that seemed rather intimidating, and checked the latch on the chicken coop. Marky did this whole routine for at least an hour or so, and eventually decided to head back to the farmhouse. As he was walking, he noticed something out of the corner of his eye that he did not originally notice. In the garden were crows, and they were eating nearly any plant that grew in the small patch. Marky immediately ran to them, and started shouting and flailing his hands. The crows lifted off, and fluttered into the air. Marky breathed a sigh of relief, but was soon shockingly alarmed. running from the distance, was an incredibly fast figure. Marky turned to see a large full-grown male pit bull sprinting towards him, barking and snarling. Marky sprinted in the opposite direction, barreling through the garden. He breached the small patch of foliage, making way to a large wooden fence to climb. Marky climbed up the fence, and fell off as he was making his way over it. Marky could see through the horizontal boards that the dog ripped its way into the garden, and began thrashing around, making a terrible mess. Within a few minutes the tall kid from in the farmhouse came running and hollering. The dog quickly ran off, giving Marky the signal to stand and shout to the teenager. The teen was not in the mood to even speak. He shouted in a very stern tone, "Hi, you fucking brat. Get out of here so I can clean this shit up. Jesus Christ, kid." Marky blushed uncontrollably at being scolded, and ran to the evergreen tree in which he had stored his bike. He collected his bike, and began speeding off from the farm, terrified he would be blamed for ruining the garden. Marky slowed down as the farm came out of sight, and felt guilt-ridden. He came to a stop and thought to himself that there had to be a way to pay the farmer back. The crows were the reason that anything had even happened in the first place. After a moment Marky shrugged, and was about to start moving, until he looked in the distance and spotted old Hodge's place. Marky began riding a bit, and slowly approached the front of the path leading to the old building. Marky looked up towards it, and nearly fell off his bike when he saw the figure in the window. Marky looked once more, and saw the figure was a scarecrow on the second story, and not the person at all. Marky suddenly correlated what he was looking at, and made up his mind to take it from the house. Marky knew that if he could bring his own scarecrow to the farm, the garden would never be a threat from those damned birds again. Marky slowly walked up the pathway to the house. He got to the front steps leading up to the old porch, and nervously began fidgeting. He knew this would be one of the only ways to prove that he meant something. He wanted to impress that teenager, have all the kids he knew about sing of his triumph. He took a deep breath, and slowly ascended the stairs. Each step was tremendously hard to make. Marky forced himself forward, and eventually reached the front door of the abode. With a nervous shaking hand, he reached for the doorknob. He pressed forward, and the door creaked ajar. Marky felt a sense of bewilderment. He entered the front room of the house and stared in awe. The place was almost completely covered in dust from all sides. Cobwebs hung so low from the ceiling that it seemed as if those entire sheets of woven silk were reaching to engulf the floor. Light shined through the many cracks which shone through the top of the house. Marky began moving forward, heading up the staircase that would lead him closer to his goal. He trotted upwards looking at the various picture frames that remained in this old desolate house. Pictures of younger women from the past, who by now would be nothing but a memory. Other pictures of family members staring blankly. Marky hated the idea of the pictures staring at him as he walked upwards into the second floor. He felt as if though they would judge him, and blame him for stealing something. Yet he pressed on and made it to the top. Marky could see many closed doors down a semi-dark hall. The only door that was open revealed his target. It was an old scarecrow that sat arched on a box facing out the window. He quickly moved forward into the room, and got near the scarecrow. Marky nervously reached out and grabbed it, expecting it to jump out at him. He quickly realized the scarecrow was rather heavy. As Marky stepped backward, the scarecrow fell to the floor with a rather large thud. Marky winced, and waited after it hit. He wondered if someone may have been in the house and heard it. Quite possibly a murderer or worse. Marky snapped this thought out of his head, and lifted the scarecrow. Marky hefted the scarecrow down the steps, and quickly to the front door. As he entered the porch, Marky felt a snag. He looked back to see the scarecrow's leg had something sharp protruding from its ankle. Marky dropped the front end of the doll, and inspected a bit further. The scarecrow's leg protruded a large stiletto blade attached to a hinge. Marky was perplexed, and decided to take the scarecrow to somewhere less open. Marky moved the burlap man into the backyard, and sat him down on a bench. Marky ran back to grab his bike, so he could stow it somewhere hidden. As he got near his bike, he was shocked to see a figure standing in the front. The figure was a small child, just a few years if not months younger than Marky. He was a pale white, and a rather small kid wearing dirty clothing. Marky approached his bike slowly, while staring at the kid. As soon as Marky's hands touched the bike, the other child spoke. "What are you doing at old Hodge's place?" Marky rebutted quickly. "Just looking around for anything really. What's your name?" The small child stared at the ground, and mumbled under his breath. Marky shrugged and decided to walk his bike to the backyard, but was interrupted when the child finally spoke up. "My name's Jimmy. Don't be coming to Hodge's place again." Marky turned around to see that the child known as Jimmy had completely disappeared. This made him become a bit nervous, so he strode his bike a bit faster into a nearby bush, and made a dash back to the bench. Marky observed the burlap man. He was about 5 feet tall, and weighed at least 10 pounds. Marky looked over the scarecrow, trying to find the stiletto hinge that stuck out earlier, but it all seemed to be gone. After a few more minutes, Marky decided to haul the burlap man back to the farm on the outskirt farm. Slowly he managed this task, and made his way back to the garden. After a few minutes, Marky had the scarecrow dangled against the side of a shed. Within a few more minutes he would have it in the garden. Suddenly a voice chimed from behind him. Marky jumped at the sound, and looked to see it was the teenager from before. "Hey kid, you're done for the day." "Wait, where did you get that thing?" Marky shrugged a bit, and spoke. "Got it from old Hodge's place. It helps with the crows." Suddenly the teenager's eyes became incredibly wide. His mouth was slightly agape, as his eyes fixated on the burlap man. He soon spoke in a stuttering tone. "Look kid, just take that to barn and put it up. We'll handle it later." Marky begrudgingly agreed, and began dragging the burlap man to the old barn. He hated how heavy this damned thing was, and the fact that he had been hauling it around for nearly an hour really made the situation a lot worse. Yet he arrived to the barn door and shimmied it open. Slowly he dragged the scarecrow deeper into what appeared to be an abandoned row of horse stalls. As the boy finally managed to lean the burlap man against the back wall of the barn, something sent a shrill fear down his spine. As Marky turned around, he spotted the pit bull from earlier. The dog arched its back and began snarling. Marky slowly pressed himself against the back wall of the barn, nervously panting as the animal became more aggressive. Marky looked to his right and saw a horse stall that had been blocked by a gate. With a sudden jolt of speed, Marky hopped onto the fenced-in stall and scrambled his way over. The pit bull immediately lunged forward, sprinting towards the child. Marky managed to get to the other side of the fence, but that didn't stop the pit bull from slamming up against it. The dog was ravenously foaming and snarling. If it kept trying to force open the gate, it would only be a matter of time before the animal was upon Marky. The pit bull suddenly switched targets and began staring at the scarecrow. The pit bull pounced upon the burlap man and began ripping and tearing into its weak fabric. Marky began shouting at the dog, terrified that it would destroy the scarecrow, making his whole trek into Hodge's place a waste of time. Marky could only sit and watch in horror as his gift of penance was shredded began to take place. The dog suddenly stopped growling and began whining in pain. It looked as if though it had its mouth caught on something in the scarecrow's chest. Marky stood and walked closer to the scene. He watched in horror as several long clamps began to protrude from the burlap man. The scarecrow sprouted dozens of various metallic hinges adorned with various tools. The burlap man began stabbing the animal in the face with its mechanical devices. Marky saw thistle-like needles attached to spools of twine. They sunk into the dog's head and pulled it into the chest of the burlap man. Marky's legs dropped from under him as he watched the horror unfold. The burlap man was stitching into the dog and pulling it into its body. Needles and stilettos sliced through the dog's skin, and slowly new mechanical devices began stitching rows of burlap into the dog's flesh. Marky could only watch silently as the burlap man slowly engulfed the canine. The scarecrow was like massive snake devouring a rat. Much like a snake, it soon ended, and all that lay on the ground before the fence to the stalk was the burlap man, swollen to the point of bursting, drenched in blood, and simply gestating. Marky slowly stood and moved forward. He looked at the bloated burlap on the floor with nervous eyes. He climbed back over the gate and made sure to jump off so he could put distance between him and that thing. As soon as Marky landed, the burlap man began convulsing and ululating. Marky could hear the sound of the dog being sliced and stitched. The bones of the canine were being snapped and mutilated within the stomach of the automaton. With a lurch, the burlap man spasmed violently, and out of its stitched frame slid another burlap man. Marky watched the entire process and saw as another burlap man came to existence. Marky dashed from the barn and sprinted for his bike. The teenager from before met him halfway, and it was apparent he was worried. The teen spoke in a stuttering voice. "Hey kid. What was all that noise?" Marky kept quiet, looking down at his shoes nervously. The teen knew something was wrong, but for some unknown reason decided not to press the issue. He soon spoke once more, in a calming tone. "Look kid, just get on home. Come back tomorrow for more work. I'll put up the scarecrow." Without hesitation Marky nodded, and ran to his bike. In a mere moment he was speeding off down the old gravel roads that lead from the farmhouse. Marky didn't even pay attention to Hodge's place as he sped home, and by the time he reached his destination, it was already becoming dark. Marky ate dinner with his mother, and talked about his day as best as he could. He didn't mention the garden, or the scene that unfolded in the barn. Afterwards, he went to his bedroom, and decided to finally sleep. That night Marky had a terrible nightmare that repeated everything he had seen in vivid detail. When he awoke from his slumber it was nearly 8 a.m. Marky got dressed, and ate a meager breakfast. The whole time he kept repeating in his mind that the events he saw must have just been an illusion. Yet Marky was still very unsure. He left the house, and mounted his bike. Then naturally, like the day before, he began riding to the outskirts farm. As he rode he saw many people getting ready for work, and leisurely walking. He knew that they were blissfully unaware at the eve he witnessed, that no one would ever believe him. Finally Marky neared the road to old Hodge's place. He glanced at the porch and spotted the kid known as Jimmy sitting on a swing by him. Marky waved to him as he passed by, but was suddenly taken back by an unnerving shock. In the window where he had spotted the burlap man sat 3 scarecrows. Marky immediately stopped his bike and threw it out from under him. He looked back to Hodge's place, his heart sinking deeply into fear. Jimmy was gone. More than likely into the house. Marky ran up the path to the porch of Hodge's place. The door was wide open, and wavering beams of light that illuminated the cloud of dust that wafted through the interior. Marky slowly entered the building, nervously looking around. In meek murmurs he pleaded for Jimmy to come out and go with him. Marky was terrified that Jimmy could be hurt by the burlap men. The house seemed emptier than usual. It was as if all life around the area went into remission. leaving only the memories of the past. Marky spotted a figure running up the ancient staircase. Marky quickly strode and ran up the stairs after the figure. He was determined to find Jimmy and bring him out of that old house. Marky get to the top of the stairs and spotted the same long hallway. At the end was the window where he originally saw the burlap, but now all three of them were gone. Marky gasped and turned himself around. He was mere seconds from running out of the house. He stalled as his eyes met the darkened form of a burlap figure riding towards him from the bottom of the stairs. It slithers like a snake, slowly climbing higher with each undulation. Marky turned and ran to the nearest closed door, and began frantically turning the knob. The door was tightly locked, and was not going to open any time soon. Marky gasped, and moved to the next door. He could hear the sound of the slithering burlap man scraping closer and closer. Marky was shocked as the second door was also locked shut. He scampered to the last door on the end of the hall, and gripped the doorknob. Luckily it was unlocked, and Marky was able to push it forward. He entered the room, and slammed the door with all his weight. Yet through the door reached a burlap arm. From the end of the stitch arm protruded dozens of various metallic blades and hooks. It whipped at Marky with tremendous force. The blades barely missed Marky, and slashed deeply into the wooden door. Marky gasped, and put even more force onto the door. The door slammed shut, and wedged the arm through the closed frame. Marky latched the lock, and backed away from the door. Before he could even catch his breath, the arm hanging from the shut door ripped from its socket. Marky jumped backwards as the arm fell to the floor and began slithering towards him. He scampered to the back of the room terrified. The end of the arm ripped into what appeared to be vicious mandibles. It snapped its new mouth repeatedly like a machine as it neared closer and closer. Marky screamed, and grabbed the nearest object. He threw a heavy book at the automaton snake equals, and smashed its newly formed jaws into the ground. A monstrosity wriggled and spasmed, until it suddenly felt limp. Marky slowly stepped forward, and peered at the seemingly dead contraption. It was indeed covered in a burlap layer of fabric, but beneath the clever camouflage lay something far more ingenious. It was filled with hundreds of various hinges and metallic levers. The entire creation looked like a mass of Swiss Army knives attached to the inner workings of an ancient sewing machine. In the center of this mechanical mass lay a fleshy mass of bone and muscle tissue. Marky couldn't help but be fascinated with marvelous design of the mechanical creation. Marky was suddenly taken back by a voice in the room. "I told you not to come here again, Marky." Marky jumped out of fright, and spun around. In the corner of the room sitting on an old chair was Jimmy. In his hands he held an old book. He was leisured over the pages, not even seemingly caring about his situation. Marky spoke through incredibly heavy breaths. J dot 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 who dot 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 who dot 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 hi dot Jim dot 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 Mike. "Jimmy, what are you doing? What's going on?" Jimmy replied suddenly. "Marky, it's too much to truly explain. I mean really it's not worth explaining. Let's just say I'm good at making things. I'm smart like that. And well, I tried to make something to help me. Help me accomplish something, but I failed. And that thing was the result. You took it out of the house. You fed it and it made more. Of course it came back home. But with two more. Marky, you really botched this one." Marky glared at Jimmy, and shouted, "I thought it was just a scarecrow." How would you even be able to make something like that? What's going on?" Jimmy sighed, and closed the book shut. He stood up, and walked to the burlap snake. He knelt down, and began tinkering with it. Marky watched slightly disgusted. He listened as Jimmy began speaking. "Look, Marky, you probably aren't going to get out of this situation unscathed. I don't know if you've really noticed, but these things want you pretty badly. I never knew how factly they could replicate. So, there isn't much I can personally do to stop it. But, you may be able to help." Marky's interest was suddenly piqued, and he waited to hear more. "In the basement, Marky. That's where you'll find your solution. Some gasoline, and lighters, so aerosol. You must burn them, Marky. If they are incapable of stitching, they can't continue to reproduce. Oh, and Marky, be careful." Marky spoke up rather annoyed. "You mean to say you aren't coming with me?" Jimmy retorted. "I made them, so they aren't after me. It's your problem, and you have to handle it." Marky huffed, and nodded. He looked around the room, and took in his surroundings. It was a study, with all sorts of old books, and tomes. Marky kept dogging his eyes all around, until they landed on something. He spotted a large iron poking prod meant for kindling. He quickly stroked and grasped the prod. He neared the door, and unlatched the lock. Marky took a final glance to Jimmy. As if Jimmy sensed Marky, he spoke one last time. "The basement is the center door in the left hall. It's unlocked." Marky nodded and looked back to the door. He slowly opened it, and peered outside. The burlap man was gone, giving Marky the chance to head out. He quickly walked from the door frame, and entered the hall. Marky walked rather quickly, and neared the stairwell. He descended it, and slowly reached the first floor. Marky nervously looked around, and cautiously pressed forward. The house seemed even darker than before, as if though the light of the world was too afraid to enter. Marky neared the left hall, and spotted the door that led to the basement. As he walked forward, he was suddenly taken by surprise. From the ceiling dropped a burlap man. Marky fell to the ground as it wrapped itself around Marky's body. He screamed and stabbed the iron prod into the head of the burlap man. As the iron rod connected, Marky felt it penetrate the creature's face. The rod made the crunching sound as it smashed inward. The burlap man suddenly went limp, and fell off Marky. He raised himself upwards, and looked back to the burlap. In horror he viewed the burlap man. Its chest was covered in a stitched t-shirt depicting people being hung on crosses. Marky instantly realized it was the teenager from the farm. He pried the iron poker from its head, and stepped backward. The burlap man began twitching, and spasming. Marky gasped, and ran to the basement door. He slammed the door shut behind him, and hurried down the stairs. Marky could barely see anything, it was so dark. A small window illuminated the drab basement, and revealed a red plastic canister. Marky ran to it, and began searching. He came across a lighter, and several canisters of aerosol. Marky grabbed the lighter, and flicked it. A flame appeared, and shone its meat light. Marky was shocked to see two burlap men in the distance, and the third slithering down the stairs. He grabbed a gasoline canister, and dumped it all around the ground. The burlap's men could be heard scraping faster. Marky hurriedly grabbed the lighter once more and knelt down. He lit the gasoline, and the entire basement erupted into flames. Marky turned around, and ran to the window. He scrambled on top of a table and opened the small frame. He could barely see because of the smoke, and knew he only had mere movements before he would suffocate. Marky crawled up and through the window. He was halfway through when he suddenly felt a snag. Turning around, he saw one of the burlap men grasping onto his leg. It dug its metallic barbs deep into his leg. Marky let out a hoarse shriek and began pulling his leg as hard as he could. The burlap man didn't budge, but suddenly let go as its body was engulfed in flames. Marky quickly crawled forward, gasping and coughing. He turned around and watched as fire began creeping up the side of the house. Marky was unsure of what to even do next. His leg hurt, his clothing was torn, and he was nearly to the point of passing out. Marky leaned back, wheezing and tired. He felt released it was over, and that he'd never have to speak of it again. Marky sat up in attention. His leg began throbbing furiously. He lifted his shredded pan leg in fear. He beheld his flesh, and screamed in terror. His leg had a burlap patch sewn into it. Under the fabric he could feel needles and clamps moving and burrowing. The fabric began to spread and rip upwards into his leg. Marky screamed in utter pain. He was being mutilated from under his own flesh. His leg snapped and broke into awkward positions, his tissue becoming intertwined with string and fabric. Marky howled for his mother. He was met with silence. He was soon to be burlap. He was soon to be something new, something different. The fire truck and police cars arrived at Hodges' place. They put out the fire and inspected the area. No culprit was found, and from that day Marky went missing, never to be seen again.